Good morning. Well, in the previous two, I think Molina's made an appearance. Well, her voice has anyway, so she's uh, she's sleeping quite calmly at the side of me at the moment. Well, resting anyway. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, chapter 14. The B&B. To kiss or not to kiss? That is the question. Doreen's visit to Portugal had happened a couple of years before I found myself lost in St Nicholas's Chapel. It was not the first time Steve and I had returned to the UK after sailing to a new life years earlier. But whereas those visits had been for 2 or 3 days and for very specific engagements, this visit was more general. It was therefore not only the matter of the time that we had been away from England, but also a more relaxed itinerary that gave us the occasion to observe in ourselves similar observations the Englishwoman had made. As regarded the British Reserve, however, it had surprised the both of us just how soon, after putting feet back on English soil, that particular characteristic of a nation's psyche vied with the culture we had now been living amongst. Having inferred that the purpose for visiting the UK at that time was for no specific reason, it should not be taken to mean that there was no reason at all. The decision to spend a week in Ilfracombe was made after accepting the fact that Stephen's parents were unlikely to make the trip to Portugal again, due in main to mounting health issues that were going hand in hand with ageing bodies. Yet although Stephen and I had the above fully in the front of our minds, we also thought of the trip as a sort of holiday, and Stephen had won me over to the idea of booking a B&B for the first night that we arrived back in England. I needed to be persuaded about the reason for staying somewhere, because for me, the idea of spending money on a room, if not entirely necessary, was a decadence we could and should forego. But my husband was not a tight man. He had grown up appreciating every penny that went his way, but that was juxtaposed with my husband's past spending patterns. Yet because of this, Stephen and I, usually finished up by finding a sensible middle ground between my reserve in spending and Stephen's more lax views about spending. And paying for a reasonably priced B&B was a case in point. Stephen had originally voiced the idea of a couple of nights at a hotel, so a less expensive option with a full English breakfast thrown in eased my pangs of guilt and my hunger pangs. The flight that we took from Lisbon was scheduled to land in Bristol at 5 minutes before midnight, and the thought of continuing the journey to Ilfracombe by car for a further couple of hours with Stephen driving had also helped convince me of the logic of resting for a night. We arrived at the guest house, which was only 10 minutes away from the airport, to find a small, clean, well-ordered, warm, bright place, which contrasted favourably with the blustery, cold, wet, dark night that we had driven through from the airport. The owners did not appear over-friendly, but they were polite and showed us to our room before a time for breakfast was agreed upon. Miles and days later, it suddenly occurred to me, as I sat separated from Stephen by the walls of St Nicholas's, that this bout of homesickness for England had begun at that point. In that very British B&B bedroom, following the goodnight wishes between ourselves and the guest house owners, the orderliness of the tea tray with a kettle, cups, tea bags, and a small packet of biscuits sparked the saudade that I had for the country, which would later appear strangely foreign to me. My melancholy mood was exacerbated by a television programme which I'd tuned into while propped up on pillows in bed. The documentary was about London at the turn of last century and centred around a housing scheme which had aimed to provide a decent standard of living for the East End's working class poor. My London of libraries and museums had been shaped by the philanthropy of men and women who sought to forge a fairer society. People such as Charles Dickens, who used his writing to show a different aspect of the street urchin or prostitute. And Britain's history of empire had shaped her politics and reacted with her island status to create a very specific identity, which I, who had relocated to foreign shores, felt pull at my loyalties. The night passed and morning arrived with rumbling tummies. After showering and packing up the few toiletries and clothes which we had used, Stephen and I made our way into the kitchen, where the B&B lady was setting the table with cutlery and crockery. The reserved reception of the previous night was not present, and when discussing it later, Stephen and I put the initial cool welcome down to the late hour at which it had been given. The three of us were chatting like old friends by the time the eggs and bacon were put on the table. The woman telling us that she and her husband were a retired couple who, after their family had grown up and left home, found they had a decent-sized property they could benefit financially from due to its convenient location near Bristol International Airport. Stephen explained a little to Dorothy about the where to and whys of our visit, along with a brief description of the events which had taken us to Portugal. Over the week, the sense of melancholy I felt had grown and deepened the desire to know the England in which I'd found myself. Yet a counter to that was my knowledge of how Portugal had begun shaping me. And if my homesickness for England had surfaced at the B&B, then so too was the Portugalification of Stephen and me. When it became time to continue our journey to Ilfracombe, it could not be said that the manner of the goodbye to Dorothy was a spontaneous action, because both of us thought about the appropriateness of the act, the way a person does when faced with etiquette in a foreign land. Yet independently, we reached the same conclusion. And in place of a courteous thank you and a handshake, there were kisses for the woman, one on each cheek.